You didn't choose silence. It was chosen for you, slowly, subtly, and sacredly wrapped in words like peace, humility, and self-control. You learned that speaking up created tension, that your truth was too loud, too much, too inconvenient. So you quieted your soul in the name of harmony. You smiled instead of explaining. You swallowed tears in the name of unity. And somewhere in that silence, you disappeared from yourself. But no one saw that part. They saw your grace, your gentleness, your strength. They complimented how composed you were, how calm, how Christ-like. And you wore those compliments like armor. You believed them because you had to. Because the alternative was too painful to name. That the peace you built came at the cost of your own voice. Let's tell the truth here. Not the polished one, but the kind your body remembers. It wasn't peace. It was survival. It wasn't surrender. It was suppression. It wasn't holiness. It was fear, dressed in scripture and silence. Because somewhere along the way, you started believing that, to be good, you had to be quiet. And maybe you were praised for it. Maybe your silence kept the room safe. Maybe your silence kept the marriage stable. Maybe your silence kept the ministry running. But silence that protects the comfort of others while violating your own truth is not spiritual maturity. It's emotional erosion, and erosion never happens overnight. It's a slow disappearing, a fading, a dissolving of self. And the worst part? You can still function through it. You can keep showing up. You can keep loving people. You can keep smiling in rooms where you feel invisible. Because silence doesn't stop your hands from working. It just stops your heart from speaking. And after a while, you forget there was ever a voice inside you to begin with. This is what happens when peace becomes a prison. When you say yes to avoid disappointment. When you hold back your truth because you're afraid it will break the illusion that you are okay. When you apologize for being too sensitive, too passionate, too human. You didn't mean to lose yourself. You were trying to keep things together. But holding everything inside doesn't hold peace. It holds pressure, and pressure doesn't disappear. It builds until your body starts to carry what your voice was never allowed to say. Headaches that come out of nowhere, exhaustion that no amount of rest seems to heal, a constant tension in your chest, in your back, in your jaw, tears that show up in the quiet, and you're not even sure why they're there. That's not weakness. That's a soul that's been whispering for too long, begging to be heard. And maybe that's why you're here now. Not because you're rebellious, not because you want to hurt anyone, but because you're finally asking, is this what God wanted for me? Did He really design you to be silent in the places where your truth was meant to bring healing? Did He really create you to suppress your voice so others could remain comfortable? Did He really call you to disappear in the name of peace? No, He didn't. Because peace that demands the death of your voice is not peace. It's submission to fear, and fear never bears the fruit of the Spirit. So now, here's the invitation. What if you could honor God and honor yourself at the same time? What if finding your voice isn't rebellion? It's reclamation. What if your truth, spoken in love, is not a threat, but a form of healing? Because here's the truth you were never taught to believe. You can be kind and clear. You can be humble and honest. You can be peaceful and powerful. You don't have to choose between being spiritual and being whole. God never asked you to become less of yourself, to look more like Him. In fact, the more you become who He created you to be, honest, expressive, alive, the more you reflect His image, not less. Because God is not a God of silence. He is a God of voice. He spoke the world into existence. He wept out loud at tombs. He overturned tables in holy rage. He called out injustice with authority. He whispered in caves, but He also thundered from mountains. And if you are made in His image, then your voice, not just your silence, is sacred. The question now is, what would it look like to find that voice again? Not in rage, not in reaction, but in realness. In the next part, we'll talk about what happens when you begin that journey, when you stop confusing silence with peace and start honoring your truth as part of your spiritual calling. Because peace that costs your identity isn't peace. And God is not asking you to shrink. He's inviting you to stand. Gently, firmly, fully. Let's keep walking. It begins with good intentions, You don't want to cause conflict. You don't want to seem difficult. You want to be easy to love. So when the moment comes, the moment to speak, to question, to express your real feeling, you swallow them. Not because you don't feel them, but because somewhere along the way, you learned that silence keeps things safe. And maybe it did. Maybe silence kept the peace in your family growing up. Maybe silence kept your relationships from falling apart. Maybe silence helped you survive in churches or friendships where being loud meant being labeled. And so you became quiet, not just in volume, but in essence. You weren't passive. You were protecting yourself, because every time you tried to say what you really meant, it was either dismissed, spiritualized, or turned against you. So eventually, you stopped trying. You started nodding instead of challenging, smiling instead of explaining, agreeing even when your heart ached in protest. You did it so well, you started believing it yourself, that maybe your voice wasn't necessary, that maybe your opinions weren't helpful, that maybe your sensitivity was just too much. And this is where it gets spiritualized, where false peace begins to masquerade as holiness. You start calling it humility. You start calling it surrender. You start quoting verses about being meek and quiet, about turning the other cheek, about dying to self. And yes, those are real, sacred parts of the faith. But when they are used to erase who you are, to dismiss your boundaries, or to justify your silence in the face of truth, they become chains, not fruit. Because God never called you to a kind of submission that erases your soul. And yet, many of us were taught that the highest expression of spirituality is agreeing, not discerning. That a gentle and quiet spirit means never asking hard questions. That being Christ-like means enduring abuse, absorbing emotional labor, and staying small for the sake of someone else's comfort. But that's not what Christ did. He did not stay silent when systems oppressed. He did not shrink when power was misused. He did not tell the wounded to stay silent for the sake of religious appearances. He called out what needed to be called out. He restored the dignity of the voiceless. And he did it without ever losing who he was in the process. So why are we still teaching people that to be spiritual is to disappear? Why are we rewarding silence while punishing emotional honesty? Why are we calling emotional erasure peace when what we're really building is performance? Because here's the truth. Forced silence doesn't create peace. It creates distance. It creates people who can sit in a room and never say what they feel. People who serve and give and pour and break, while quietly wondering if anyone sees them beyond what they offer. People who confuse obedience with suppression and faithfulness with invisibility. That's not the gospel. The gospel is not the story of someone who smiled through suffering just to keep the atmosphere comfortable. The gospel is the story of a man who spoke, who wept, who raged, who loved fully, freely, vulnerably. And the gospel you've been handed may have left out that part. It may have only shown you the lamb, never the lion. It may have only taught you to yield, never to stand. It may have praised your silence, without ever asking what it cost you. But God does ask. He asks what it's costing you to stay quiet. He asks what pieces of yourself you've buried to keep the peace. He asks where you stopped trusting your own voice and started outsourcing your discernment to those who praised your submission more than your honesty. And now that you're starting to feel that ache rise, the ache of, I don't want to live like this anymore, that is not rebellion. That is resurrection. It's the part of you that still remembers who you were before you learned to shrink. It's the part of you that still knows what truth feels like, even when it trembles inside your throat. It's the part of you that still believes peace shouldn't require you to be silent. It should allow you to be seen. And yes, speaking up might shake some things. Yes, telling the truth might cause discomfort. Yes, using your voice might disappoint people who were more in love with your compliance than your courage. But you don't have to choose between being loving and being honest. You don't have to betray your own heart just to keep someone else's peace. Because real peace, the kind that heals, not just holds things together, does not silence truth. It makes space for it. And when you begin to speak, not to fight, not to wound, not to prove, but to return to yourself, something holy starts to happen. The Spirit doesn't resist it. The Spirit welcomes it, because the Spirit is truth. And truth spoken in love isn't destruction, it's deliverance. In the next part, we'll explore how to begin finding that voice again, gently, safely, with courage and care. How to start trusting your words as sacred, and how to speak, not from fear, but from freedom. Because the voice you've been suppressing might just be the very one God anointed to bring peace to a world that's been pretending for too long. It doesn't happen all at once. It creeps in slowly. The weight, the weariness, the quiet disconnection from yourself. At first, it looks like strength. You're calm in every storm. You're composed in every conflict. You've mastered the art of restraint. People even admire it. They call it grace. They call it maturity. But what they don't see is how your body holds the grief of every word you never said. You've been applauded for your silence, but inside, your soul has been whispering, "This isn't peace, it's pressure." And your body knows, it always knows, because the voice you don't allow out doesn't disappear. It settles in. It finds a home in your chest, in your throat, in the pit of your stomach. You start to feel tension you can't explain, fatigue that sleep doesn't fix, a tightness in your jaw, a heaviness in your chest, a clench in your hands when you're pretending to be fine, because you've learned to perform peace instead of living it. And eventually, the silence becomes louder than words ever could be. That's the strange thing about emotional self-abandonment. It doesn't break you in public. It wears you down in private, not through major breakdown, but through the slow erosion of your sense of self. You stop noticing what you feel. You stop naming what you need. You stop trusting that your voice matters, because for so long, no one gave it space. So now, even when you're alone, you hesitate to tell the truth. You tell yourself you're just tired. You tell yourself you're just being dramatic. You downplay your pain. You minimize your need. You spiritualize your silence. But your body knows what your heart has forgotten. You were not created to carry unspoken truth forever. And when it goes unspoken long enough, it doesn't just disappear. It disconnects you from yourself. You start to feel like a stranger in your own skin. You feel disconnected in conversation. You feel numb in relationships. You feel invisible in the mirror. Because the more you silence your truth, the more you lose your reflection. And maybe no one ever told you this, but God is not glorified by your disappearance. You were not created to survive by being small. You were not designed to glorify God through the suppression of your emotions, your instincts, your truth. You were designed to be fully alive, fully awake, fully here. And God, the one who breathed life into you, has never once asked you to disappear to please Him. In fact, Jesus consistently moved toward the ones who had been silent. He knelt beside the voiceless. He healed the ones who were ignored. He asked questions to those no one else saw. He called out the people whose power required others to shrink. And if He saw you now, quiet, hurting, polite, but hollow, He wouldn't shame you. He would call you back to yourself. Because He knows peace is not the absence of conflict. It's the presence of truth. And truth, when unspoken, turns inward. It doesn't go away. It festers. That's why you've been feeling heavy in ways you can't explain. That's why you've been struggling to pray. Not because you've lost your faith, but because you're scared to say what you really feel. That's why worship feels distant. Not because God has moved, but because you've been gone for a while. Not physically, not in rebellion, but emotionally. You've stepped out of yourself. You've abandoned your voice. You've taught your nervous system that being seen is dangerous. You've internalized the idea that if you stay small, you'll stay safe. But safety without truth is just stagnation. And now, your soul is aching for movement. It's aching for you to come back. Not to the version of yourself that kept everyone else comfortable, but to the one you buried under years of spiritual performance and emotional shutdown. The one who once felt deeply. The one who once spoke boldly. The one who still lives in you. Quiet, yes, but not dead. So here's what healing starts to look like. Not dramatic change, not loud declaration. Just noticing again. Noticing what your body says when your mouth won't move. Noticing what emotions rise when you stop numbing. Noticing what you long for when no one is around. And then, little by little, honoring that. Honoring what you feel. Honoring what you know. Honoring what you've silenced. Because healing isn't just about forgiveness or letting go. It's about reconnection. It's about turning back inward and saying, I'm listening now. I won't ignore you anymore. And as you do that, as you begin to make space for your own truth again, something holy happens. You begin to recognize God there, in the pause, in the ache, in the breath you hold when you're about to speak, but still feel afraid. Because God is not just in the polished parts of you, He's in the process. He's in the coming back. He's in the trembling voice. He's in the quiet courage to say, I feel differently. I need something else. I'm still here, but I can't pretend anymore. And maybe, just maybe, that is worship too. Maybe your truth is not in opposition to God's peace. Maybe it's the doorway into it. In the next part, we'll talk about what it means to actually use your voice again. Not to fight, not to prove, but to reconnect. To speak not out of reaction, but out of revelation. Because your voice, once silenced, was never meant to stay quiet. It was meant to heal, you first, and then the world around you. There's a sacred moment in healing that feels both terrifying and holy. When you realize that the silence you've kept for so long is no longer protecting your peace, it's preventing your presence. You're not being the bigger person anymore. You're disappearing. And one day, it hits you. If I keep this up, no one will ever truly know me. That moment doesn't come in the middle of chaos. It usually arrives in the stillness. A conversation that should have felt safe, but you didn't say what you meant. A moment when someone crossed a boundary and you smiled instead of spoke. A prayer where you wanted to scream but only whispered, because you've trained your voice to shrink even in front of God. But something is shifting now. Something inside you is done performing calm, done pretending silence is strength, done confusing peace with people-pleasing. Because your voice didn't disappear, it was buried. And now, gently, quietly, it's starting to come back. But how do you find a voice that's been silent for so long? You begin slowly. You begin awkwardly. You begin honestly. You don't wake up one day and suddenly start speaking with full confidence and clarity. You start by saying something small, something true, even if your voice shakes, even if no one else understands it yet. Because the goal isn't to be loud. The goal is to be real. And realness isn't about rebellion. It's about reconnection. Reconnection with your own feeling, your own thoughts, your own convictions, the ones you pushed down because they didn't fit someone else's idea of peaceful or godly or good. So you begin by practicing, not performance, practice. You practice naming how you feel, even just to yourself. You practice saying, I don't agree, even if it's just in your journal. You practice listening to the part of you that's been silent, not with judgment, but with curiosity. Because healing isn't just about recovery. It's about remembering who you were before the silence took over. And remembering takes time. It takes space. It takes compassion. It takes the courage to be uncomfortable for a while. Not because you want to create conflict, but because you finally realize that silence isn't worth the cost of your truth. Let's be clear. Using your voice doesn't mean you abandon kindness. It means you redefine it. Because kindness without honesty is not kindness. It's compliance. And compliance builds relationships where you are tolerated, not known. And you were made to be known. So what does it look like to reclaim your voice with grace? It looks like learning the difference between reaction and revelation. A reaction is driven by pain, defense, urgency. Revelation comes from depth, clarity, and timing. And right now, you don't need to react. You need to reveal. Reveal what's been inside. Reveal what matters to you. Reveal what you can no longer carry in silence. And you don't have to start with a crowd. You start in the mirror. You look yourself in the eyes and say, I'm allowed to speak. I'm allowed to feel. I'm allowed to exist beyond other people's expectations, because your voice is not dangerous, it's divine. And when you begin using it, even softly, even shakily, something powerful begins to unfold. You stop apologizing for your clarity. You stop shrinking your story to make others more comfortable. You stop sacrificing your boundaries to protect someone else's version of peace. And you start trusting that the truth inside you isn't there to destroy what's good. It's there to protect what's sacred, you. your healing, your dignity, your design. Because the God who gave you breath didn't just create you to inhale peace. He created you to exhale truth. And truth is not a weapon, it's a witness. A witness that you have survived, that you have learned, that you are no longer willing to disappear. You begin to let people see the real you, not just the polished version, not just the agreeable version, but the full, complex, vibrant soul God designed, the one with edges and opinions and emotion and fire. And when you do, not everyone will like it. Some people will push back. Some people will feel uncomfortable. Some will say, "You've changed." But they're wrong. You're not changing. You're returning to the voice you were born with, the one you silenced for safety, the one you suppressed for approval, the one you surrendered out of fear of being too much. And now, that voice isn't asking to be celebrated, it's asking to be honored. In the next part, we'll explore how to walk in that voice, not with arrogance, but with authority, how to speak truth in love without compromising either, and how to live in a peace that doesn't demand your silence, but includes your truth. Because real peace, God's peace, never asks you to disappear. It invites you to show up fully, freely, and faithfully, voice and all. And now, here you are, standing at the edge of something you never thought you'd reclaim, your own voice. Not the loud, performative kind, not the one shaped to fit in rooms where you were never meant to stay, but the real one, the steady, grounded, gentle but fierce voice that remembers who you are and refuses to be silenced again. You've come through layers of silence, survival, and spiritual confusion. You've unlearned the lie that peace means disappearing. And now, something deeper is happening. You're no longer just trying to speak. You're starting to live from a place of truth. And that changes everything. Because here's the truth. You were never just fighting for a voice. You were fighting for your existence. You weren't asking for attention. You were asking for alignment, for the outside of your life to match the truth that's been buried inside. And that alignment is what creates real peace. The kind that doesn't demand silence, the kind that doesn't fracture your soul, the kind that lets you breathe deeply in your own skin. But this part of the journey, it's not always easy. There will be moments when you'll want to go back, not because it was better, but because it was familiar. Silence is seductive like that. It feels like safety when the truth feels risky. It promises you control. But that control comes at the cost of your clarity. And clarity is what you're learning to choose now, even when your voice trembles. So what does that look like in practice? It looks like knowing when to speak and when not to, based on wisdom, not fear. It looks like walking into a room and not shrinking to fit it. It looks like disagreeing without guilt, setting boundaries without explaining, choosing rest without apology. It looks like peace that includes you, not just everyone else. And this is where it gets spiritual again, because your voice is not just emotional, it's sacred. It's part of your design. It's part of your calling. It's not just for relationships or self-expression. It's a vessel for the spirit of truth that lives inside you. God didn't just give you words, He gave you discernment. He gave you a sound that carries authority, not domination, not aggression, but presence. And presence speaks, even when it whispers. You weren't made to walk through life quietly accepting what wounds you. You were made to walk in wholeness, and wholeness requires your participation. It requires your voice, because silence doesn't always equal peace. Sometimes, silence is a symptom of pain that hasn't been given permission to speak. So now, you give it that permission. You allow the version of you that's been locked inside to step forward, not to fight, but to belong. You start to see that the courage to speak your truth is also the courage to live in love, real love. Love that doesn't demand your smallness, love that doesn't twist scripture into submission, love that honors your humanity and your holiness in the same breath. And this is where your voice becomes healing, not just for you, but for others. Because your courage to be honest will give someone else the courage to feel again. Your refusal to disappear will give someone else permission to be seen. Your decision to break the cycle of silence will become the beginning of a new legacy. The legacy of a faith that doesn't silence, a faith that listens, a faith that breathes. A faith that tells the truth, not in anger, not in pride, but in love so deep it can't help but be honest. So what happens now? You keep walking, not toward performance, not toward perfection, but toward presence. You keep honoring your truth, even when it's misunderstood. You keep trusting that the God who created your voice didn't do it by accident. He doesn't regret making you passionate, or sensitive, or bold, or intuitive. He doesn't cringe when you say something real. He's not disappointed that you finally stopped hiding. In fact, He's with you in every word that brings you home to yourself. He's not just the God of the mountain. He's the God of the voice that cried out on it. He's not just the God of quietness. He's the God who gave the prophet's word, who gave the poet's breath, who gave the broken permission to speak, who gave you your sound. And maybe, just maybe, your voice is the exact thing this world needs, not the version others shaped, not the echo of who you were told to be, but the whole, unedited, holy version of you who now refuses to vanish in the name of false peace. Because real peace doesn't ask you to sacrifice your soul. Real peace walks with you into rooms you used to tiptoe in and says, "You belong here." Real peace doesn't mute you. It amplifies you with gentleness, with wisdom, with unwavering grace. So go ahead, speak, rest, show up, be still when needed, and bold when called. Let your presence speak even before your words arrive, because you've finally remembered what was always true. Your voice is not too much, your truth is not dangerous, and your peace was never supposed to cost yourself.